Okay, sorry for this. We thought the laptop was sleeping and we had to wake it up. I'm sorry for blowing it. So you probably already guess who's the next speaker, Marijn Huizendveld, with how to relate your OKRs to your technical real estate. Please welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. This is me yesterday at the Halloween costume party, Silver Bullet. Today, no silver bullets. After this 50 minutes, you'll be able to turn your existing OKRs into a Wordly map. Now, when you map, you start to graph your dependencies. And when you do this, you are able to articulate how some of the higher level objectives that you want to achieve as an organization are limited by some of the constraints within your technical real estate. Now, with this newfound situational awareness, I think you'll be able to drive collective decision-making within your organization. And I'm convinced that with that, you'll be far more effective at implementing your strategy. So my job is done here today if you're as excited as I am about trying to apply these ideas at home. But I want to give you a word of warning. This talk is really about combining OKRs and Wordly maps. So it's not a talk about either one of these topics, although I'm not going to assume you know either one of them. And also, there will be corny visual metaphors. So, like it was mentioned, my name is Marijn Huizendveld, and I work as a consultant for scale-ups that want to have teams remain effective after they've significantly increased the number of people and teams in their organization. So yesterday, somebody was asking me at the conference, at what level I operate? I thought it was a funny question because it kind of implies that we have a shared model of what levels there are. But what I said is, I think that in order to be effective as a team, you need to operate at various levels, right? We need to be able to have a team that is skillful, right? They have tactical ability. We're at a domain-driven design conference here, so we need to have a team that is able to talk to customers and stakeholders and extract valuable domain knowledge and turn that into useful domain models. That same team needs to have the skills to take repetitive code and be able to extract that and put that into value objects that can be reused throughout the system. They need to be able to describe the behavior of the system in a way that is not coupled to implementation when they're writing tests. And they need to be able to hide various complex subsystems behind interfaces and anti-corruption layers so that they can focus their efforts on modeling the problem space. But if they have all of these abilities, they're able to march very effectively, but maybe they're marching off in the wrong direction and they're headed off a cliff. So as an organization, we also need to provide these people with a purpose, a direction, an understanding of why we're going a particular direction and why we haven't chosen to go in a different route instead. And we need people to be able to challenge the strategy that we've chosen. So on one hand, we need tactical ability. On the other hand, we need direction, strategy. But these two are not enough, right? We need to have the ability to have teams operate based on that strategy. They need to be able to propel the organization forward. Now, the story that I'll be sharing here today with you is based on me playing around with a strategy that was handed to me by a client right here in Berlin. And so let's go and get started. So how does strategy help us? Imagine that we're on this road, right? The road to success. And we're sitting there, we're cruising along with the team. And at some point, some of your teammates says and shouts, wait, there's a pot of gold standing right over there. Now what do? Should we stop? Or should we continue? Because what is waiting for us at the end of the road is going to far exceed what we're going to find here. Or is this perhaps the point where we have to pivot because we've just struck upon a gold mine? Now, strategy is a focusing mechanism. It allows us to interpret what is happening around us in the environment, and it informs us about whether a change in the environment is a mere distraction or whether it's something to take very serious. Now, the organization that I was working with, they used OKRs as a focusing mechanism. So OKR stands for objectives and key results. So the objective is something aspirational that gets the team excited and jumping out of bed every morning. It's perhaps the reason why they've chosen to join this organization over another one. Throughout European cities, it's actually very difficult to attract talent to our organizations. So this might be one of the reasons why somebody chose for us rather than somebody else who is competing for tech talent out there. So the objective is something that gets people excited and aim for the stars. Now, key results are the metrics that inform us that we have achieved the objective. So what you'll see in most organizations is that for each objective, you'll have 3 to 5 key results, right? They are key performance indicators, quantifiable indicators that tell us that we have achieved the outcome that we're aiming for. Now, most organizations have trouble, just like most humans actually, have trouble focusing on just a few things, right? We're always more ambitious than we have time and attention. So what most organizations do is they'll have 5 objectives with 25 key results, and this gets rather overwhelming for a lot of people. So one of the things that I would recommend to all of you is actually to focus on fewer objectives and limit the number of key results so that the cognitive load of dealing with all of this is simpler and that you can focus on just one thing rather than doing multiple things at once. There is actually a silent H in OKRs. We should have called it OKR HMS, but somehow that doesn't really roll off the tongue that nicely. This is what Christina Wodka once said. And the H stands for health metrics. Now, many organizations actually forget about this, but these are the metrics that inform us that we aren't burning any important bridges and that we aren't sacrificing any assets in the organization that we don't want to be sacrificing. Now, this is very important, right? Because we can mess up trying to achieve our objectives many times, but we can mess up our health only once. What do you think of this objective? I'm not talking about the book here, by the way. It isn't the best objective, right? Because this objective is output-oriented, right? It's finish this project, or make this app, or add this feature. It's not really about what we're trying to achieve by introducing that project, that feature, or that app, right? And that is a bad objective, because why do objective and key results work? Well, we're setting objectives that are aiming for the stars, right? But we provide a team a lot of flexibility and autonomy on how to achieve this particular objective. We provide some guardrails in the form of health metrics. We don't want people, for example, to be sacrificing the acquisition of new customers at the expense of losing our existing customer base. So we want to make sure that we provide the team with an outcome-oriented objective where they are able to decide themselves on how they're going to achieve these goals. So having an output-oriented objective is a bad plan. Now let's imagine that we work for a company that is competing with one of these businesses, or all 3 of them actually. So the Gorillas, the Getir, and the Flinks in the world. We're working for Shopee Floppy. And our objective is to catapult ourselves into the market for everyday items whenever we're entering a new particular region, right? So these things tend to be opened up in various parts of bigger cities, right? And whenever we start to enter in that particular sub-part of the market, we want to catapult ourselves into that market, right? This is what gets our junior people excited. Now, the key results that we could identify, for example, are having revenue of 100,000 euros at 30 days after launch, right? Having 50% of the customers refer friends and family, and having at least 250 reviews, of which 80% is 4 out of 5 stars or higher. These are clear, quantifiable results that tell us that we have achieved the objective. Now, obviously, we as a team setting the OKR agenda have come up with these metrics ourselves. We have set the boundaries ourselves. So there is a self-assessment happening here. And we all know what happens when we're self-assessing. We might be lying to ourselves. So it's important that we are able to share what we're doing and why we're doing it with the rest of the organization. And also how we're going to measure that, so that people can tell us that maybe some of the measurements we're using are not as accurate as we think they are, or that maybe some of the measurements are not going to inform us about success because we are misinterpreting that particular indicator. Right? So it's important that we think about the way we structure these key results, but also how people in the organization challenge them. Now, some health metrics, right? An important asset of this company is obviously the team, right? So we want to make sure that the team happiness stays on 3 out of 3, right? So that people are just satisfied. Now, again, here we're talking about a self-assessment. So it's important that we feel that we provide people in the organization the safety to be able to openly and transparently communicate about team happiness. The cost acquisition of any particular new client should be below the average order profit, right? Because otherwise we tend to lose money on a lot of these things. And another health metrics could be that the cash flow in always needs to exceed the cash flow out. Because the only reason why companies go out of business is because they run out of cash. So here are some common causes of failure with objectives and key results. Now, the first one is set and forget. So we're all excited about it. We're setting new objectives and key results. We spend a bunch of time with people in rooms or in Zoom to, squeeze out these highly achieving targets. And then we go on minding our business as usual. And we completely forget about what we're actually committed ourselves to, right? So one of the reasons why this happens is we don't really have a cadence at which we're checking these things, right? We get caught up in the day-to-day, and this is one of the most common failures that I see people make the very first time they try OKRs. And what I haven't mentioned so far is that typically organizations set a time frame of about 3 months to achieve OKRs, but obviously, as an organization, you can choose yourself, right? So certain organizations choose shorter intervals and certain choose larger. I myself would suggest to go for shorter intervals. Another one is not aiming high enough, which obviously causes the student syndrome. We can easily manage that. Let's also do some refactoring first, right? Because that's fun. Postponing what we're actually doing because we think we'll easily make it, and then we underestimate the situation, and in the end, we aren't actually achieving our goals. Now, the opposite of that is the too ambitious goals, right? This happens a lot as well, where we aimed not for the moon, but for Mars. And as a result of that, we never get to experience the high with the team that you get when you achieved something that seemed pretty impossible up front, right? Because this is one of the fundamental powers behind OKRs, right? We're aiming for something that we think we can make happen within about 50% of the cases, and half of the time will be right, and half of the time will be wrong. But as a result of that, we achieve greater things than we would have done otherwise. Now, sometimes we'll see that the OKRs are really not business goals, right? They're replace RabbitMQ with Kafka. Well, obviously this is output-oriented, but I see these things happen a lot, or vanity metrics, finish writing the plan. These things aren't moving us forward, right? So we want to have objectives and key results that really relate to business goals. Finally, making decisions for the team, right? Some of the people that are going to be involved in the goal-setting process will have great ideas on how we can achieve some of these things. Unfortunately, they have great ideas on how we can achieve some of these things, and with that, they rob the team of the autonomy to do the work themselves, right? Now, as I mentioned, a cadence is important, and one of the easiest ways that you can do that is have a weekly status email. A very simple thing where you just have some visual cues that inform you, that allow people to quickly scan the email. This is what we've been working on. This is what we'll be working on next week in terms of big picture priorities. And here is how confident we are that we're going to make the objective. If it's higher than 5 out of 10, it's green. If it's lower than 5 out of 10, it's red. You get the picture. And now you want to be transparent. You want to send this to anyone in the organization that is interested. And this will get you in trouble. I speak from experience, because this is what I did. And then somebody in the organization started to weaponize some of this information. Wait a minute, we're spending this much money or we're doing this and that with that project. Now, obviously, this person went about it in a rather aggressive way, and I wouldn't really suggest to do that. But in principle, I encourage it, because it makes us, as an organization, challenge what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? It's talking about the optionality. Wait a minute, we could have also spent this budget somewhere else. So keep the email to the point, but make it fun to read as well. Make sure that it's scannable, and it will really drive the adoption and also the cadence within the organization to stay focused on the goals that you have committed yourself to. So I love OKRs when done right. You need health metrics, you need frequent check-ins, and you need a status email to inform the rest of the organization. But if you do, you can achieve great things with them. Back to my client. So here it is, the strategy for the current quarter and the next quarter. It's like a 17-sheet long presentation, font size 12, a few pictures. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And that's obvious because, you know, I'm a consultant and I don't see everything that is happening in the organization, right? I don't have all of the visibility. On the other hand, that's the value of the consultant, right? You look at things differently. So I saw a lot of moving parts, but I was unable to relate some of it to what I was seeing in the day-to-day practice. So I figured, you know what? Here's what I think we should do with the strategy. No, not like that. Sorry, don't get me wrong. Let's look at it from a different angle. Right? Because if we look at things from multiple angles, that will yield us valuable insights. And so quite often people will say, but we've done this already in another workshop. Sure, but let's try to look at things in a different way and maybe new insights will emerge. Now, this organization had a 17-page long document that entailed this part of the strategy. And I don't know, have you ever had that somebody asks you, like, you know, can you tell me how to get to Brandenburger Platz and or Brandenburger Tor? And you're like, my phone is empty. Sure, take the second to the left, 800 meters, then cross the square diagonally, and then walk a bit further, and then it's the third alley to the right, and then you're there. And then they walk away, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, or was it the third to the left and then to the right? Stories for navigation are really a bad format. But this is what we were using in this organization, and you know, it's difficult because challenging it doesn't really scale because we have to have one-on-one conversations because we don't really have a common language on how to challenge this strategy, right? Every conversation is an entirely new conversation, and that doesn't work in organizations that are growing. So what should we do instead? Well, tell me, you have to go somewhere. What are the first apps that you open on your smartphone? Map, all right, what else? Twitter. Okay. It's like, I can postpone going somewhere. What did you say? TripAdvisor, yeah, all right. Well, I tend to check the weather because I'm from a country where it often rains, but these apps provide you with situational awareness, right? Like how far is it to go there? How could I go there? Well, I could be walking, but is it smart given the climate conditions of today, right? So having a map and looking at the climate can inform you about, you know, what a smart way would be to move within the landscape. So here we're looking at a map, and this is overlaid on it is a little table with the model of a map by Simon Wardley. So Simon Wardley is the author of Wardley Maps, and well, the model of a map it's a model, right? It's useful sometimes. So let's go over it, right? So his perspective on a map is that, you know, a map has to be visual. Well, we're looking at it, you know, it immediately provokes a mental image, right? You immediately start to form some thoughts in your consciousness, right? It has context. It's about a specific thing, right? It's not a map of the world over all eternity. No, it's a map about Greece. It's a map of a particular area in Greece at a particular point in time about a particular battle in Greek mythology. The map has position, right? We can see individual components on the map, and we can point at those things. And if we point at somewhere else on the map, it means that we're somewhere else, right, in the landscape. And that's the case because all of these items on the map are positioned in relationship towards of the anchor, right? Now, in most geographical maps, the anchor is the magnetic north, and it's not always displayed anymore because it's common practice and it's implied. But this is why we can have consistency of movement within a map, right? If you move across your finger across the map, you're moving across the landscape effectively. We can visualize movement, right? That's the red arrows that we're seeing. Attack the enemy over here, block the passage over there. And that allows us to talk about how we want to act within the landscape. And finally, components, right? We see mountains, we see crosses for cities, we see land masses, seas, whatever we needed to talk about this particular problem. So what would a map look like for business? Well, so in a map for business, well, what we're actually first going to do, we're not going to create a map. We're first going to create a chain of needs. And our chain of needs for Shoppy Floppy starts with the lazy person, right? The couch potato that doesn't want to go out and buy groceries, but wants to order them instead. And what does this person need? Well, they need consume everyday items, right? So they need things like eggs, potatoes, coffee, milk, I don't know. But obviously, if they wouldn't need them right now, they would just be ordering them through a regular grocery delivery platform, right? So we need a sense of urgency, right? This is an essential component in a decision to choose for Shoppy Floppy over, Rewe, Albert Heijn, or Co-op. On the other hand, we need the Shoppy Floppy offering, right? We need the products that we're selling, and that needs, in turn, our catalog, right? The things that we're offering, at which price points we're offering. Price points. And we need the everyday items, and we need pricing. Now, what you're seeing there is the everyday items are a little square. I'll get to that notation later on, okay? For now, just assume that it's a collection. So we have pricing, and finally, we have our suppliers, right? The pricing is influenced by our suppliers, and the everyday items are sourced from our suppliers. Are you all with me so far? Okay, yes? Is it visible in the back? It was really challenging to make a map big enough, yet meaningful enough. So, all right. So what we've done actually is we've been focusing on our users, right? Our user, the couch potato. And we've been focusing on their needs, right? What do they want? They want everyday items within 10 minutes, right? So that's resulted in this chain of needs. How do we get there? By simply asking the question, what do we need in order to, right? So ... needs. That's the language trick that you can apply to move down in the stack. Now, there are a lot of things within when you're doing Wardley mapping that you can borrow from the event storming discipline, right? So when we're event storming, it is always recommendable to go for a big picture session first before you start to dive into the details. Now, if you're in an organization and you're working as a team that is responsible for some kind of subsystem, I would recommend to first make a map of the entire organizational offering and only then to dive into your specifics. Because otherwise, you might focus on some kind of internal user for which we think we have a user need, but the user need is really just there because that's always how we've been doing things, right? So maybe there's better ways to solve the problem, right? So first, go for a big picture approach, and then go for something a bit more detailed, oriented at your specific context. So focus on those user needs, right? Not on outcome. Now, one of the principles behind Wardley mapping is everything evolves. So imagine it's the 60s, and we're a fly on the wall in the boardroom of Bell Laboratories, right? So somebody is driving, this giant thing into the boardroom. It's the size of a fridge, parks it, gets the cigarette out of their mouth and says, here it is, a mobile phone. And, the people in the boardroom go like, wait, what? And they walk around it, and, well, I mean, this thing is held together by, rope, and it's a giant mess, but there's no cables attached to it. And if we punch the key codes, we actually can call our mother. So it demonstrates the concept, but it isn't exactly a sellable product, right? We're just sort of amazed by it, and maybe similarly appalled. Now, 10 years later, right, it's the 70s, and this same company is making custom-built phones for the military, for generals to call with one another. I don't know if they're going to be talking strategy or beers, but whatever. And roll forward another 10 years, the Wall Street trader or that weird uncle that all of us had, is carrying around one of those suitcases, and wherever they can go on a terrace, they'll, park it right there on the table and, very obviously start making phone calls like, yeah, I have a mobile phone. And, well, if you're my age, 10 years later, we all had a Nokia 3210 in our pockets, right? Like, okay, hey, Mom, I'm coming home. So everything evolves. It evolves from the novel, right? The things that, wow, can we do that? To the custom build. We've built it once for a customer, but if we would have another customer for it, we would have to do it again. To a productized form, where we can sell it to a general market, and ultimately to a utility commodity-based form, where people really don't care whether they're using one version, one product or another, right? It's become interoperable, and it's just become the expected norm. So everything evolves, and that's the movement that we have in a Wortley map. So we see these 4 stages here, right? Genesis, custom build, product or rental, and commodity utility, right? And I've started to put these things in there, right? So what do you notice when you look at this map?
The lazy person is a commodity.
Yeah. Well, so if you understand Wortley mapping, you don't need to understand the domain. You can immediately start to ask questions about what's happening, because there are sort of general principles that apply regardless of the specific landscape. So that is very useful. All right. We were talking about that, I was mentioning that pipeline, right? So that little square block that you see, how you have to imagine that is, this is a bunch of things, right? And it's sort of an OR, right? So there are many products that we're selling, like eggs and coffee are really, accepted as products for selling. But we started to experiment a year and a half ago with selling COVID tests, right? Self-tests. And actually, nowadays, we're even offering HIV tests, but we're not really sure if people really want to buy those. But this is how some of these things evolve through that pipeline, right? But you can simply visualize that just as that square block if you're not interested in those details. And we see that happening again for the suppliers. We might have new suppliers coming in, and maybe we're saying goodbye to some suppliers. So imagine that to be there, all right? Okay, so just to reiterate, how do we make a map? Well, we identify the user, which is the anchor of the map. And then we list the relevant needs of that user. So right now, I've only shown you one need, but sometimes there are more. But when you get started mapping, just focus on the most important user, focus on the most important need, and limit yourself to, let's say, 10 to 25 components, okay? Because that constraint will allow you to get going rather quickly. And once you have something, it will be easier to improve it rather than to get something perfect right off the bat. Now ask what component is needed to dive into that graph of dependencies in order to see what we need to satisfy our user needs. And finally, once we have that chain of needs, we start to put it on the axis of evolution. Now, maybe you don't all agree with your team where to put it. That isn't always that important, because it's there now, and we can start to challenge it when it is important. So spend time on it, but don't try to get consensus all the time. You have to wonder, is it really that important that we all agree for this component where it is? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And finally, everything evolves. So from Genesis to custom build to product to commodity. Now, what do we get when we start to Wortley map our ecosystem? Well, we make our assumptions as explicit, right? And we make it easier to challenge the strategy that we're going about. Why are we spending our energy here over there? We can say, we're now focusing on this area, but shouldn't we do something closer to the user? One of the things that people often talk about when they're using Wardley maps is, let's take all the custom built stuff and use some productized or commodity form instead. But we can spend an awful lot of time replacing things in our ecosystem without adding any value to the user. So the Wardley map, having that and visualizing that, allows us to challenge some of those decisions. Right? Like, okay, if we do that, we're not going to show anything meaningful to the user in the next 2 years. Where is that going to put us in the market? Now, different areas of the map require different sets of skills and attitudes. You can imagine sort of gyro gear loose people are needed in the area of novel and Genesis, right? Where, pardon my cultural insensitivity, in commodity will likely have a great benefit of German engineers. Finally, we can trace down the value chain to understand the risk and impact on the end user. So by going down the chain of dependencies, we can start to see how some of those dependencies are affecting some of the things higher up in the chain and the other way around. Okay, great, Marijn, but maps, what about those OKRs, right? So we can put ourselves on the map. There we are, shoppy floppy. We're in Genesis because we are burning VC money at an unprecedented rate. But we are rolling out in various markets, right? We've done that and we're doing that every time, new and new again. So that's why catapulting into a new market, I've put that in custom build. And here is the hypothesis that we have in order to be effective effective in entering a particular market. We think we need high average order value. This is a hypothesis that we have. This is a hypothesis that is driving one of our objectives, okay? And, well, doing some user research, we found out that some of the customers think that, our products are too expensive. So their perception of value is different, right? So we need to do something with price communication. And one of the things that we want to do is do some sort of strike-through price, right? To show, well, this is what it's costing you with us, and this is what it typically costs you somewhere else. Or this is the type of offering that we have for you today. It's a little cheaper than normal. And that has a dependency on our pricing component, right? So if this is an objective that we are setting ourselves out, now the team can start to challenge this, right? They can start to say, I'm really excited about this thing, but unfortunately, you don't know what the pricing service looks like. And some of the choices that we've made there within that component are not going to allow us to easily implement the behavior that is needed for strike-through pricing. However, knowing what we're trying to achieve here, the higher order objective, increasing the perception of value, I propose that we do this instead, which is what we are possible to do today with our current pricing component. And so by relating the objective on one hand and the constraint within the system on the other hand, people in the team can say, this won't work, but given the objective that we have, here are some of the alternatives that we want to propose. Right? So we're bridging the gaps there. And we can also start to visualize how we're making progress, right? If the perception of value, that's what we want to move actually to the right. Maybe there's some inertia there. Maybe we're realizing that it's really difficult to convince users of this. Or maybe there is inertia is this little block that we're seeing there. And it can be anything, right? I've once been the inertia on a map where I was like, oh no, but we spent so much time custom building this. I don't want to get rid of it. It can be different things. It could be the fact that as a result of that, another team is affected. It can be multiple reasons, but we can start to visualize it. And by having it visual, we can start to talk about how we want to deal with solving this. Now, maybe the labels were confusing you a bit. So one of the things that you can do is you can just use different labels for the different stages, right? So in the case of a hypothesis, you could say, well, the hypothesis is new, and then it's divergent, convergent, and then finally it's become accepted, right? So this is how you can visualize the hypothesis moving through the axis of evolution. Okay, so OKRs and Wordly maps. Tribes, departments, teams, they can be the anchor on the map. And we can put their needs on there. In this case, the needs are going to be the objectives that they have to achieve, right? And then below those objectives, we can put the various hypotheses that we have in order to, that we think that might drive this objective forward. Now, I've just shown you one hypothesis because space limitation and people in the back also need to be able to read it. But typically, you will have more hypotheses, and so you could start to visualize them, and that would allow you to ask the question, why here over there? Why are we focusing on this one thing first, rather than this other, where the team feels more confident about it? So the hypothesis can be a set of components, potentially within a pipeline, if you want to visualize it like that. And as proof accumulates to support our hypothesis, the hypothesis moves to the right of the map. So we can start to visualize how we're making progress, or what type of direction that we want to see. We can also visualize the inertia that we experience in order to achieve our goals, and that should drive communication about some of these problems and obstacles. And finally, the map is a vehicle to point out organizational bias, right? So if we map, we can talk about why are we doing some things custom built when they are available in the market as product or commodity solutions. Do we think we're so special? Okay, I wanted to put this in because yesterday Dennis Doman was saying this. Don't take what everyone at this conference says for granted. And I think that's great advice. I mean, I showed you some really nice, neat examples, but the reality of it is this is what it looked like, right? This is the blurred out NDA-compatible version. There are like 45 components on here, but as you see, there's a lot more to it. And on the top left, you see all of the questions that somebody had based on this map. It helped me get better understanding of the situation. In this particular case, it didn't necessarily allow me to influence anything, but it did help me understand what people were trying to achieve and why I also think they failed in certain areas. So how does this relate to DDD? Well, mapping will help us build up a common language, right? Because when we're doing all of these things, we have to give components meaning and names, and those names can be shared within teams and within the organization. It will help us think in terms of abstractions, right? Initially, that's going to be very difficult. I now used rather short words for a lot of these things, but when you start mapping, that's probably going to be difficult. So I would recommend to just use more elaborate labels initially that are very well and descriptive, and over time, the abstractions will start to reveal themselves to you. So accept that you won't make a perfect map right away, but the mapping process will help you think in terms of abstraction. It focuses you on user needs. And I think that is very valuable. By starting at the user need and then moving your way down into the stack, you can start to think about things more granularly, and I think that's very helpful. And finally, maps allow us to differentiate our approach, right? In one area, we need Gyro Gearloose. In the other one, we need the German engineer who's very precise. Now, looking back and looking into the future, OKRs work when they're frequently evaluated, and the objective should inspire, and it should aim for the moon, right? It should be something that we're really excited about. The key results really should be measurable, and they should indicate success. Now, when we start to visualize these things in a map, we can start to, it should become clear why we've chosen to go about this particular strategy rather than all of the other possible things that we have done, right? This is one of the moments where it's probably helpful to have consensus to a large degree, or if not, that people disagree and can still commit to the course that we've set out. We want to combine OKRs with Wordly maps to articulate the business and technical strategy within a single picture. This is one of the biggest benefits, I think, of Wordly maps, is that in most other approaches, we have to look at two pictures, right? The current situation and the situation that we're aiming for. But a Wordly map allows us to visualize both in a single picture. Now, the nice thing about the map is that it allows us to uncover the assumptions that are below, all of the thinking that have gone into the map, right? Maybe you disagree with the fact that the catalog is where I've positioned it to be on the map, but now you can start to point at it and challenge it. And this is really just as with event storming, right? Rather than pointing at each other, we are pointing at the problem and we can come up with solutions together. It unifies the language, right? Because we're creating this shared language at various levels, and it's not just a language on how we talk about the individual parts of the system, but it's also the language that we use to talk about strategy, aka the map and the OKR. And it allows us to share knowledge within the organization. So I have some resources if you are interested in learning more about this topic. If you're eager to learn more, then you can check out my website, follow me on Twitter, or you can find me in the hallways. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. And I actually think we have some time for questions now. So if anybody has one, we can take about 5 minutes of questions. Marco.
Hi. I'm wondering, when I do event storming, I can collaborate with lots of people at the same time, so no problem to have 16, 20 people in front of a large wall. When you do Wardley mapping, how many people and what kinds of people do you bring to the collaboration? How does it work?
Okay. So the nice thing about Wardley mapping is that you can steal pretty much anything from Alberto. So you can do anything that you do in event storming, and you can do it in Wardley mapping to be effective. So what are we doing when we're event storming? In the first part, we are trying to leverage the diverse perspectives of the audience, right? Everybody is putting domain events on the canvas at their own pace, in their own formulation, and we're really diverging in terms of the viewpoints. So how I do this in a Wardley mapping workshop is I have participants initially work individually so that they cannot bias each other. So I will ask them to come up with various users of the system. Now, some groups will come up with very good users, others won't. So depending on the results, as a facilitator, what you want to do is check out what you're seeing and potentially, after this first round, already do some cross-pollination. Have people compare, and then maybe as a facilitator you say, we're going to focus on just this one single user right now, because focusing on a single user will make it easier to get to an end result. Now we're doing that same thing again. We're saying we're going to identify the user needs. So we'll have people work individually, and we'll ask them to come up with 3 user needs. We're going to, again, limit it, because otherwise it will be too many. And after this round, again, we'll do some sharing of people, like, well, what did you come up with? And this is a moment where we're trying to pick probably 1 or 2 user needs to focus on, depending on how much time you have. But again, it's better to just do the first and get to the end result and then add a second, rather than getting halfway through and not having a map at the end. And then from the moment onwards that we have the user needs, that's when we start to ask the question, what do we need in order to, right? So component needs ... So this is the moment where we start to act collectively as a group. And because people have been warmed up a bit by looking for the users themselves and the user needs, they typically are more collaborative in this phase of the process. However, we have to embrace the fact that there's going to be ambiguous language and not ubiquitous language. So some people will call something and somebody else will think of a completely different concept, right? Because we haven't really introduced sane boundaries here. So it's very important that we keep on contextualizing what we mean, not use too shallow language in this part of the process. But that's an ongoing thing. I typically take about an hour for getting through a chain of needs. That's still a short amount of time, but usually you can get to a point where people are reasonably satisfied, and then about 15 minutes for putting things in the axis of evolution. And especially if you do some of these things in online, that can really be fast, right? Because there's a lot of copy pasting. If you're in a physical situation, it's obviously going to be a bit more challenging, but I would recommend to use lots of paper, sticky notes that can easily be moved, but really have a significant amount of wall space, just as you would have with event storming. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Over there, Christina?
Thank you. I really liked it. What I was wondering, in the department OKRs, you change the user, the department. So the user need could be lost and I become the user. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you would have both users on there, right? So maybe it's best to just go back in the slides for that, because so we see two users on here, right? We see the lazy person, they're still up there, and we see our department, they're up there. I would actually recommend to put users on there that are internal, but obviously we need to know that their needs are, to some degree, less important than the needs of the end user. But imagine that you have to work with some kind of senior executive who is really uncollaborative, and you don't know how to move forward with this person. You could, just put that person on there literally by their name for yourself. I would not recommend to do this in public, and start to think about what are their user needs, and then start to relate what they need back to what you need as a team or as an individual operating in that organization, and see how you can somehow create sort of a win-win offering where you can get this person to collaborate again with you, right? So the short answer being, yes, you might have multiple users and they will show the conflict, but this conflict is there, right? It's not if we remove it that the conflict isn't there, it's just the end of an illusion. Yeah. I had a startup in online ticket sales, and one of the things that we were always struggling with was the fact that our customer was the ticket seller, but our user was the ticket buyer. And you need to satisfy both of their needs, but there is an inherent conflict between them. And for the long-term interest of the ticket seller, it is very important that we satisfy the needs of the ticket buyer. But short-term, we're really better off sacrificing the needs of the ticket buyer. And I wish I would have known Wardley mapping back then, because I think it would have helped us make better choices about resolving some of the friction that is going on between that. So I would recommend that if you're in a marketplace solution where you have merchants and buyers, that you definitely visualize both of them, because you can really, it can really drive the conversation about how to resolve the conflicts between them.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it was my pleasure to be here today. I hope to see you in the hallways. Have a nice conference.